Chapter 7. "How could this have happened?" came the outburst from somewhere in the middle of those seated in the council chambers. The emergency session of the Grand Council of Galimar had been called soon after the news of the destruction of Traxus had come. All on the planet were hanging on the words of the news agencies that had been covering the disaster. Most on Galimar hadn't met a Traxian person themselves, since the program of personnel exchange had only recently been put in place. There were only about 100 Traxians that had come to Galimar, but that was just a drop in the very large ocean of Galimarian people.
Before we discuss this, my fellow council members, I'd like to propose that we invoke Testimonial Law Statute 9385-73, allowing the council to discuss matters while not being broadcast for reasons of planetary security,
replied the coordinator. Testimonial Law Statute 9385-73 was a statute that had been passed many years before, allowing for discussion of matters while not being broadcast across the planetary network. According to the statute, this type of situation was put into place in cases of where the subject matter could be inflationary to those on the planet, or to those that had a material interest in the matters to be discussed. Even though this particular testimonial law had been passed well before the Traxian planet had been discovered, and so it was originally oriented toward the people of Galimar, it was obvious that this law applied to the few Traxians that were now marooned on Galimar. One of the Grand Council members raised his hand, stood, and turned to address his fellow members. "My fellow council members, personally, I hold the public nature of the Grand Council to be one of the best ways to ensure that this government be one that is run and regulated by the people. As we all know, though, Testimonial Law Statute 9385-73 was created for cases when the subject matter would potentially cause problems with those that have a material interest in the subject matter being discussed. I'd say the situation we have witnessed on the planet of Traxus qualifies under this guideline. I move that we sequester our discussions." The coordinator raised his voice and said,
"Those that agree with the proposal to sequester the discussion of the Grand Council as it pertains to the subject matter of the disaster on Traxus, please raise your hand."
There were several that did. However, it wasn't obvious where the simple majority laid. After a few seconds, the coordinator spoke up and said,
"It appears that the vote to sequester these proceedings is close to an even split. According to testimonial law, the vote in this case need only be a simple majority, and so we will need to register your votes on the voting pads."
Each council member had a small table in front of them, which they could use to take notes or to temporarily place items they needed to keep handy. Built into this table was a voting pad with a simple set of yes/no buttons, which would allow their vote to be registered on whatever proposal was being decided at the time. As each council member leaned forward and pressed the button representing their vote, the results were then displayed to the coordinator via a screen built into his podium. This screen allowed the coordinator to easily see not only when all members had entered their vote, but also the tally. The coordinator looked up from his screen, showing the tally, and said, "As evidenced by a simple majority, the proposal to sequester discussions about the disaster on Traxus has passed. To those that are listening on the planetary network, any decisions that are made regarding this subject matter and any other discussions unrelated to Traxus will be published at the end of the day." With that, the coordinator lifted a cover on his podium and pressed a recessed button. Taking this small step caused several things to happen simultaneously. First, all doors around the Grand Council chamber clicked and locked. Any who were in the room were there for the duration of this meeting, and any supporting personnel who were outside the room were now prohibited from entering. As it was, all members of the Grand Council were seated, and there were no unauthorized personnel in the room. Finally, the audio and video broadcast of the council proceedings all ceased. Those who had been listening were presented with a title screen containing information about how the Grand Council was currently meeting under secure circumstances. When the indicator lights above the recessed button turned green, the coordinator now knew that this meeting was secure, and he was free to speak.
Council members, we are now secure, and we are free to speak about the matters at hand,
said the coordinator.
The question was raised how this could have happened. I must warn you that the answer to this question is rather unpalatable.
The coordinator paused for a moment while looking down, but then looked up and said,
How did this happen? The answer is that it happened because of us.
As one would expect, this statement was very surprising to the council. A sharp outburst emanated from just about everyone in the room. After waiting for a few seconds for the unrest in the room to settle, the coordinator continued.
I have asked Dr. Mundial to be here with us in this emergency session. He has analyzed the data coming in from Traxxas and has come up with some startling conclusions.
The doctor was already walking up to the platform, and as soon as he arrived, the coordinator said,
Doctor, would you please present your findings to the council?
The coordinator turned the podium over to Dr. Mundial, and as he stepped forward, those who had risen to their feet returned to their seats. Esteemed members of the Grand Council, I wish it was under different circumstances that I address you today. However, I feel it is imperative that you be made aware of the true reasons why it appears that all the population of the planet of Traxxas has been destroyed. Pausing for a moment, the doctor continued, I was asked to evaluate all the data that we had available to us, both public and private, to determine the real reason why this had happened. Most of what I have to go on is part of the public record. All of that data seemed to point to a natural disaster that caused some of the naturally occurring minerals on the Traxian planet to react unexpectedly with some explosions that had happened deep under the ground. It appeared to all who would be looking that it was indeed a natural disaster and nothing more. However, the doctor continued, shortly before all transmissions from the planet ceased, there was one lone transmission that came from our Galimarian ambassador stationed on Traxxas, which, I am sad to disclose, has apparently perished in this same disaster. According to the ambassador, there was one solitary soldier in the army of the Democratic Republic of Traxxas who went by the name Major Machina that revealed to him what really happened. According to this major, there was a rogue faction of that government that had decided that the economic pressures being put on their nation by a neighboring nation merited their causing a disaster that they thought would be localized to a relatively small area in their neighboring nation. Their theory was that the more prosperous nation would suffer serious needs, and then the DRT would come in and be the saviors. I am sorry to tell you that they did this by modifying power generators that Galimar had supplied them. There was a hushed gasp on the part of the council members. They modified the generators in such a way that they would cause a feedback loop. This loop, however, ended up interacting with one of the minerals in their planetary crust. Apparently, their scientists were split on whether the reaction would be localized or not, but regardless of the risk, the rogue faction decided to move forward with the operation. What they didn't anticipate was that not only did the plan work, but the chain reaction that some of their scientists were worried about also happened, even beyond what they had feared. The explosions and the related energy fields generated by the Galimarian power generators touched off a chain reaction that was impossible to stop. It basically vaporized the topsoil of the planet and turned the atmosphere into an unbreathable soup of gases. Unbreathable, that is, to the Traxians. Early reports said that the atmosphere was radioactive. This turned out to be false, but Traxian physiology is such that their lungs require oxygen to live. The chain reaction caused all oxygen in the atmosphere to be eliminated, along with several other gases, and the only remaining gas was nitrogen. As a result, all life on the planet that we are aware of has ceased. The doctor paused once again, and then said, "Are there any questions?" None came. The council was so stunned and saddened that none were able to come up with much of a coherent thought. Devastated was the best way to describe how each in the room felt. Galimar had always been a planet that respected the sanctity of life. Knowing that technology originating on Galimar was used in this way, and that it resulted in the death of untold millions, even billions, was far too much to handle. Looking out over the audience, the doctor not only felt terrible for the massive devastation that had happened, he also felt bad for the effect this news was having on all the members of the Grand Council. Most of these members were there when they had decided to open diplomatic relations with Traxxas, and they were the same council members that had decided to allow the sharing of technology with that planet. Knowing now that the sharing of that technology set in motion a chain of events that eventually led to the planet being decimated like this, was probably the most terrible feeling that each of the members had ever felt in their lives. One and all felt like they personally had a hand in the death of every man, woman, and even the children, the poor, defenseless children. Devastated, overwhelmed, shocked, distraught, and shattered were all words that were floating on the minds of each member present. But even these words didn't approach how badly they felt. Seeing that no questions were coming, the doctor parted with, "In case you have any questions in the future, you are welcome to visit me any time in my offices at the University of Meropa. Thank you." Turning to the coordinator, the doctor stepped off the stage and left the coordinator to continue the meeting. It was an unusual exit, though. Usually there was applause to show appreciation for the presentation that had just been given. This time, though, there was no applause. In fact, the only sound that could be heard was the sound of Dr. Mundial's footsteps as he retreated from the stage. Slowly, the coordinator mounted the stage once again and looked out over the council chambers. The mass of faces looking back at him bore out the same mire of feelings he was personally experiencing. he saw a combination of sadness and grief that would almost be impossible to quantify. Eventually, he knew he had to move the meeting along.
So, my fellow council members, what remains now is deciding what we are going to do with this knowledge, and what steps we are going to take to keep this from ever happening again.
One lone hand raised from the middle of the group. Seeing the hand, the coordinator responded,
"The floor recognizes Lord Aramin."
Jobiah stood slowly and spoke. From the overwhelming gloom evident in this room, I can see that all here share with me a sense of tremendous personal loss. I am of the mind, though, that while we cannot ever change what has happened, one fact remains, and that is the truth that we as a people are not going to stop being who we are. We are a peaceful race of enlightened explorers who will continue to stretch our arms out into the universe. We will continue to search for understanding amidst the ever-present unknown. But there is another unmistakable truth that we have learned here, and that truth is how the planet Galimar is not alone in the universe, and that some of those civilizations are not as advanced as we are. It is obvious to me that we need to consider changing our policies on how we interact with other worlds. Jobiah sat down. Another hand was raised in the back of the council chambers. The coordinator responded,
"The floor recognizes Lord Janal."
Lord Janal stood.
"I agree with Lord Aramin. It is obvious to me that we will need to create amendments to testimonial law, guiding how we approach interaction with other worlds from today onward. But I also feel strongly that Galimar should know the reason why this happened. Out of respect for the fallen, I don't believe it would be prudent or wise to reveal to Traxian refugees or the people of Galimar in general that it was Traxus itself that caused their own deaths. Still, though, all should know why we will not share technology indiscriminately."
With those words, the Grand Council began what amounted to some of the most sweeping and pervasive changes to testimonial law that had ever been adopted. Every single law found in the Testimony of Galactic Land and Maritime Law was reviewed over the following 2 weeks, and where needed, changes were made that ensured the testimony was updated throughout. The new and updated testimony was now structured so that every interaction with alien life forms would be done in such a way that Galimar would never again be an unwitting accomplice in the destruction of any life. What they couldn't possibly know, though, was that these landmark changes would even affect a world in a completely different galaxy. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.